And Zohra, thank you so much for making this time to talk to us. And we really appreciated your participation in the dialogue that we really don't take for granted. But we still thought we could delve a little deeper into your thinking. Particularly, let's begin from the fact that you are a global policy advisor with the UN Women. How do you define gender responsive budgeting and financing for gender equity? Quite a loaded question, you know.
Thank you, Wisdom, and I think that's a great place to kick off. So we at UN Women, and I think the international community, define gender responsive budgeting as the process of integrating gender equality objectives into the public finance management system of a country. And gender responsive budgeting has a long history. It has been pioneered by the UN and other international organizations for almost 3 decades now, and has taken root in several African countries, including countries like Morocco, Rwanda, Uganda, to name but a few. It is a very practical way in which we can ensure that whatever the country defines as its national gender equality objectives are really, integrated into the planning and budgeting process, so that we have programs that ultimately impact for the better the lives of both women, men, and girls and boys.
A practical way, and indeed pioneered in several states or countries, but do you think that this is well understood and implemented across Africa?
I think it is well understood, although the understanding varies, as you can well imagine. As I said, we have been doing this work for a very long time, and African countries have been very instrumental in experimenting on gender responsive budgeting for the past 30 years. And that's why we have some of the most advanced experiences on gender responsive budgeting in African countries, Morocco being a leading example, but as I said, also, countries like Tanzania, South Africa, and so on. However, countries change and administrations change. And so it is a process of, I would say, continuous capacity strengthening of public officials. So, this is not a one-off thing. We can't say that across the world it's understood in the same way, or it's implemented in the same way, because the practices emanate and come from very different places. In some countries in Africa, it's come from civil society organizations. Tanzania is an excellent example of that. The Tanzania Gender Networking Program was very, very instrumental in the 80s and 90s to pioneer gender budgeting in Tanzania. And in some cases, it's come from parliaments, from governments themselves. So the methods that countries use are very, very different. But we see some common threads across all countries. And that is really, that countries have strong laws and policies on gender equality. They're enshrined in the constitution. And they're really just looking at how they can actualize these laws and policies. And for me, gender responsive budgeting is really an excellent way to do that.
Yes, good examples here. It's been tried for quite some time. African examples coming out good here and there. But you did, during the dialogue, identify that there is chronic underfunding to gender equality initiatives across the globe. What should the African states really be doing in order to improve the efforts towards particularly achieving SDG 5?
Well, first and foremost, there is chronic underfunding and insufficient investment in gender equality globally. So this is a global phenomena, and we see it even in advanced economies. And that's why no country has achieved gender equality, in my view. What we need to be seeing throughout the world is really scaled up investment. A couple of years ago, UN Women did some costing work in 5 countries across the world. And we found that sometimes they were financing deficits as large as 90%. So what this means is that while countries are designing and developing very good laws and policies on gender equality, they're not allocating or assigning the financial budgets to implementation of these laws. So they just remain laws on paper. or policy on paper. It's actually unimplementable. So how do we implement these? By using our fiscal policy. That's one tool, and that's the budget. So how we raise taxes, how we then spend these taxes, combating illicit financial flows to ensure that money doesn't leave countries. But we've also seen lots of innovation in Africa over the past couple of years. We've seen gender lens investing, and gender bonds are something that countries are increasingly taking up. And so countries are looking also, in addition to government, looking to the market to find ways in which they can raise resources to implement gender equality programs. And there's two reasons for this. One is that, investing in women is investing in half your population, or more than half your population in some cases. And where we don't make these investments in women, we're really wasting our resources, because we know that women tend to invest more in their communities, they tend to invest more in their families, and that just creates a virtuous cycle for society. So it's really a smart thing to do.
And while we're still grappling with the issue of chronic underfunding to gender equality, and comes COVID, dealing quite a big blow to gender empowerment. What should countries then be doing now to reverse the effects, particularly on inequality in gender financing?
Wisdom, I think that's an excellent question, and it's something that the world is grappling with now. And I think COVID hit us so suddenly and hit us so hard that across the world, the impact, negative impacts reverberated. No country anywhere in the world was immune from the impacts of COVID. But what we saw was that the pandemic was hitting women the hardest, right? They were especially impacted by the economic and social fallout of the pandemic. And this is because, when governments immediately instituted lockdown, shutdown policies as a way to control transmission of infection, we see then a result in, this resulted in an increase in domestic violence, right? So as victims of domestic violence, women were locked down with their partners. In some centers, violence response centers reported something like a 500% increase in support for services. We also know that as unpaid caregivers in families and communities, that women tend to pick up more domestic labor than men do. So prior to the pandemic, women were doing 3 times more domestic labor. And this just intensified with the pandemic. And then when we look at where women are in the global economy, and many of them are in the informal sector and lack social protection, we found that these were the women that lost jobs at an alarming rate. And they also had the least access to social protection and other measures that would ensure that they at least had income in order to support themselves and their families. And on top of that, we saw a very limited integration of women in decision-making process around how we deal with COVID. So the fact that women weren't in COVID task forces and so on really impacted the response that governments were then designing in order to address that. So yes, there have been significant setbacks, and it took us quite a while to find our feet. We're in a very different position today. For one, we have more data on what the impacts of the COVID pandemic have been on women. So we are not operating from nothing, we're operating from the position of knowledge, and that's incredibly important. We also have a vaccine that we know works. Despite the variants that we're seeing across the world and the spread of the variants, we know that the vaccine is quite effective in ensuring that people are protected from severe impacts of COVID, hospitalization, death, and so on. So it gives us a better chance of dealing with this virus. But of course, the issue of vaccine equity becomes a massive problem, because we are not seeing a huge amount of global solidarity on vaccine access around the world. And we're seeing many, many countries that are still lacking vaccine access, and that's a huge problem. On the other side, we've seen countries really inject massive stimulus into their economies. So rich countries have been able to do this quite effectively, and the United States is one such country. And in poorer countries, we've seen things like debt suspension. We've seen things like social protection measures such as cash transfers and so on. And these are all very positive examples of how I think countries can get their economies back on track. So I do believe that this has provided us with an opportunity to really shift the discourse around unpaid care work, around the care economy, around violence against women. And it's really forced us to be thinking about what economic model we have and whether it's working for all people, because it certainly isn't. It hasn't been for a long time. And again, we're seeing in countries that are advanced capitalist countries like the United States, that they're really now focused on building what they're calling a much more caring economy. So they're investing in things like social protection policies. They're investing in things like care work and so on. So I think this has made a difference to how countries perceive what is important in society and what we need to be valuing in society. And that really is a caring economy.
And indeed, all that does define gender responsive budgeting and financing as a subject that's very much faceted. And I would be interested to understand your view on what then should be the role of higher institutions of high learning. What should be their role in ensuring that we're winning in this direction?
I think for me, two very clear things. One is research and data. So really doing the research and data that we need to inform effective policymaking. And I think that's incredibly important. And the other is around training. So making sure that, those who are in positions of authority, the policymakers and so on, but also those who are at the front line of service delivery and so on, have the tools and have the approaches, have the methodologies that they need in order to address this pandemic in a way that makes sense and that gets us out of it. And we've seen many examples across the world. UN Women, and in fact the whole UN system, has really benefited from the work of academic institutions, whether it's in terms of looking at developing vaccine development and so on, or looking at the impacts of COVID, the economic impacts, the social impacts, and so on. And those really need to feed into how we understand this epidemic, this pandemic, how we respond to this pandemic. So I think there is an essential role for academic and research institutions to play in combating this, and in fact, future pandemics as well.
I did mention earlier on that we appreciated the fact that you participated in the dialogue, Innovating Financing for Gender Equity and Implementing SDG number 5 in Africa. But I was wondering, why did you think that that was where they're participating in?
Well, for one, I was invited, which was great. And I think that when I did my background research on the Alliance, I think that the Alliance has an incredibly important role to play in advancing the discourse on gender responsive budgeting, on financing for gender equality, and so on, not just in the context of COVID, but even beyond. And I think, given who your membership is, that the focus on applied research is critically important in this, and I think it's something that we could use more of. And of course, again, training the next generation of policymakers. I think academic institutions are so incredibly important in making sure that they provide the right orientation to the future generation of policymakers that are going to go out there, get jobs in government, and try to develop and implement policies. We've seen across the world really fantastic initiatives that higher education institutes are doing around even, rethinking how we understand the global economy. So rethinking economics, rethinking philosophy, rethinking sociology. And I think Africa has such a critical and important role to play in really making the rest of the global community understand what Africa is, how rich it is, how diverse it is, in terms of its people, in terms of its intellectual capacities and so on, and really bringing that to the fore. So I'm super excited, and I think the Alliance for us is very much a natural partner.
And talking about alliances, what do you see as some potential achievable next steps for collaboration in this area?
I think that given where the alliance partners are, those countries are countries that have a huge amount of experience on gender responsive budgeting and financing for gender equality. So I think we really need to be drilling down at the national level and trying to identify, in consultation with the UN system in these countries, how we can advance this research and training agenda. And I think there are opportunities. We need to really have those discussions and define those opportunities, but that has to be done at the country level.
Beautiful. So thank you so much once again, Zohra, for your time. This has been beautiful, just as it was when you joined us in that dialogue.
Thank you, Wisdom. It was an absolute pleasure and so nice to speak to you as always.
Beautiful. You enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.